Hey y'all! It's entry number 77 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Jerry Jeudy, wide receiver, Denver Broncos. We'll start with the positives with Jerry Jeudy's fantasy profile. Quarterback upgrade. The Denver Broncos made a trade for Russell Wilson this offseason, who will be by far the best quarterback that Jerry Jeudy has played with in his career. Over the course of his career, Wilson has averaged 19.5 completions on 30 passing attempts for 234.6 passing yards and 1.85 passing touchdowns per game to just 0.55 interceptions per game according to Pro Football Reference. Having a quarterback that can throw 25 or more passing touchdowns a year bodes well for Jeudy and the rest of the Broncos pass catchers. The next thing I really like about Jerry Jeudy's fantasy profile is his first round pedigree and potential. Jerry Jeudy was drafted in the first round of the 2020 NFL Draft. Going into the 2020 draft, Jeudy was being called by many as the best route runner in the draft class, and Jeudy's route running ability has popped out on tape in the past. Now that he's entering his third year, where wide receiver breakout performances are more abundant from a percentage and raw numbers perspective in year 2 and year 3, this could be the year that Jeudy capitalizes on his massive potential. The last thing I really like about Jerry Jeudy's fantasy profile is his target separation. In 2021, Jerry Jeudy was the number one wide receiver in terms of target separation, with 2.45 yards, and target separation versus man, with 2.37 yards according to Player Profiler. He's an elite route runner who knows how to get open, which should only help him in fantasy leagues. Moving on to some of the concerns with Jerry Jeudy's fantasy profile. Might not be utilized as the number one pass catcher. The Denver Broncos have a pretty talented wide receiver room even with the injury to Tim Patrick, with Jerry Jeudy, KJ Hamler, and Courtland Sutton. Sutton has already had a great year back in 2019, where he had 72 receptions on 124 targets for 1,112 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns. Having talented competition could prevent Jeudy from seeing a large target workload in 2022. The next thing that concerns me with Jerry Jeudy's fantasy profile is that his current ADP is based more on his potential and not what he's already accomplished. Jerry Jeudy has a ton of potential, but actually hasn't had a great season yet. In 2020, Jeudy had 52 receptions on 113 targets for 856 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. And in 2021, he had just 38 receptions on 56 targets for 467 receiving yards and 0 receiving touchdowns in 10 games according to Pro Football Reference. These are barely fantasy relevant seasons in your typical fantasy league settings, so he absolutely needs to make the jump to live up to his current ADP, which is 64th overall on ESPN. The last concern I have with Jerry Jeudy's fantasy profile is his drops in the past. Jerry Jeudy tied for the second most drops in the NFL in 2020, with 9 according to NBC Sports, and his drop rate of 11.5% was one of the worst marks among wide receivers according to RotoWire. He improved last year, but still posted a drop rate of 5.4%, which was below average for a wide receiver according to RotoWire. Some additional thoughts on Jerry Jeudy's fantasy profile. In 2021, Jerry Jeudy finished as the WR95 in Standard, with 47.0 total fantasy points and 4.7 fantasy points per game. The WR89 in half PPR formats with 66.0 total fantasy points and 6.6 fantasy points per game. And the WR85 in full PPR formats with 85.0 total fantasy points and 8.5 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Jerry Jeudy had 3 out of 10 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 6 out of 10 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, and 1 out of 10 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points according to fantasy data. In 2020, Jerry Jeudy finished as the WR43 in Standard, with 105.6 total fantasy points and 6.6 fantasy points per game. The WR44 and half PPR formats with 131.6 total fantasy points and 8.2 fantasy points per game, and the WR45 in full PPR formats with 157.6 total fantasy points and 9.9 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2020 season, Jerry Jeudy had 5 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 8 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 1 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 0 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 2 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. The Denver Broncos made a coaching change this offseason, and will have a change in play callers because of it, going from former offensive coordinator Pat Shurmur calling the plays to new head coach Nathaniel Hackett calling the plays. Hackett has gotten slightly above average production out of his wide receivers over the course of his career as an offensive coordinator, but we'll have to see what approach he takes as a head coach. Personal opinion: Jerry Jeudy is currently going off the board as WR21, about pick 64 overall on ESPN, and WR24, about pick 67 overall on Yahoo. I'm a big fan of his route running ability and think that he will have a big year eventually, but this ADP seems on the higher end of where I'd feel comfortable taking Jeudy, as he's currently going ahead of some proven wide receivers that have already showcased high fantasy ceilings, some examples being Allen Robinson, Michael Thomas, and Chris Godwin. As for the Courtland Sutton or Jerry Jeudy debate, I think that Jeudy may have more talent and upside than Courtland Sutton, but Sutton seems like the better fit for the type of receiver that new quarterback Russell Wilson has had success with in the past. Jeudy could certainly break out, but I don't anticipate myself grabbing a ton of shares at him at his current cost. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Jerry Jeudy's My Cause My Cleats in 2020 was for the Trisomy 18 Foundation. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.